He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
And we are live. That's what my job to say is, because I'm the producer. It's the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. And we're taking a slightly different approach with our guest today. This is still all about health, all about taking positive steps to make yourself healthy. But where we have mostly been focused on the stuff you put in your pie hole and the negative effects from putting the wrong stuff in your pie hole, we're doing a little different orifice today. I cracked myself up. Phil, introduce our guest.
Yeah, although what our guest today, Michael Rubino, talks about, some of it comes in through your pie hole and some of it comes in through your nose. And we're talking about the air around us and what effects that might have on your health. I heard Michael on another podcast recently, and I'm trying to remember who it was, but I can't quite right now, but I thought it was a very interesting discussion, a topic that we've started to certainly look into with some of our patients who, toxins from the environment, not in your food, and the impact that it might be having on your health. So very interested to talk to Michael about this. Michael, why don't you give a little bit of your background to our audience, maybe talk about how you got interested in air quality, and mold specifically is something we're going to get into as well. Just kind of talk about what got you interested in all of that.
Absolutely. Yes. Hi, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Michael Rubino. I'm an indoor air quality expert. I've been in this field roughly about 13 years now. My certification is a CMRS, which stands for Council Certified Microbial Remediation Supervisor. It requires 10 years of documented experience. And basically, that experience is physically in the field, fixing homes and uncovering problems inside of homes. I didn't, wake up as a kid and wish I was going to become a CMRS and get all this experience. It kind of happened naturally. So first off, my dad is a second generation restoration contractor. So I've been around construction my entire life. I am from the Northeast, particularly New York, New Jersey area. And so my career really started right after Hurricane Sandy happened to hit the Northeast, decimated thousands and thousands of homes. And it was about a 10-year journey thereafter of going in and seeing people and having them complain of illness or non-optimal wellness, not feeling well, all kinds of crazy symptoms, and really starting to connect the dots between what happens in our homes and how it impacts our health. And so I'm really excited to be here today because it's a ever evolving science. We learn new things every single year. Recently just did a deep dive into some of the studies that came out in 2022, just because I'm always trying to figure out how else can I help people decipher this information and make the most of it, helping people live their best life through the power of air quality, which, really, as you mentioned, doesn't get a lot of credit.
Yeah, we had a previous guest on who, was also kind of involved in air quality, mold, and they dropped a pretty shocking statistic on us that I want to see if you kind of agree with this. I believe he said that 80% of the buildings in the United States had air quality problems. Sick building, I think, is the kind of terminology. Is that accurate?
I wouldn't disagree with that statement. I think it's hard to prove. The largest home survey ever done suggested that 50% of homes had a history of water damage and 80% of those homes had visible signs of mold. Now, I could definitely draw the correlation there because as I start to see mold problems, I can tell you that so many homes I've been in, like Gwyneth Paltrow's home or so many celebrities' homes, their homes look immaculate. Like they've literally been photographed for magazines, but yet they might have hidden mold problems. And so I think a lot of it comes down to what you can't see, not necessarily what you can see, that I think draws the bigger picture here. But yeah, I mean, I think, 80% is not provable, but I'll tell you, it probably is not that far off.
Okay. Now, mold is, I guess, could be considered one of the longest living organisms on the planet, right? It's been around for a long time, and mold has been around probably for the whole time that humans have been around. And it's fairly ubiquitous in our environment. It's kind of everywhere. So, what is it, right? When do we cross into it becoming a problem for humans who have been, presumably, like I said, surrounded by mold and breathing it in outside all the time? Why does it seem to be becoming more of a problem, would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's going to be many different answers layered into this. But I want to take a step back for a second and just go over what mold is, right? Because mold is typically a word used to describe over 100,000 different species of fungus. And so I think it's important to highlight that, because when we say things like mold is ubiquitous, it also could leave us in despair a little bit, because unfortunately, yeah, there is a spore that you will find if you test the air at a minimum, right? And so if I test the air inside my house, I test the air outside my house, the odds of me finding a spore is going to be 100%. So when we talk about mold being ubiquitous from that perspective, absolutely. But I'd love to rephrase the conversation, just because I think it's really important for people to understand there are all these different species of molds that we want to be considerate of. And of course, we also want to understand the quantity of those molds and how it relates to the air that we're breathing on a consistent basis when we are outside our house, when we're inside our house, and in other homes and in other places. So I think it's really important because it helps shape the conversation. So I like to say mold is everywhere where it's growing, right? In order for mold to actually be outdoors, it has to be growing on the trees or growing on the leaves and reproducing those spores. And then you have to have a machine that collects those spores into a slide. And then those spores then go to a mycologist who is counting, using microscopy to count the individual amount of spores that they see under this microscope. So now that you have a little bit of sense of the process of how this all goes, I think it helps shape the conversation around, why is mold a bigger problem today than it seemed to have been many years ago? And what are the types of molds that we really want to be concerned about? So really, we have to go back into history, 1970s, Richard Nixon's president. We're dealing with a global energy crisis. What do? We start pushing towards energy efficiency. Now, through that push, there's been some unintended consequences. So the way in which we construct homes today in 2025 is greatly different than the way we constructed homes 50s. 1950s, we had balloon frame houses. There was essentially air gaps between our exterior walls and our interior walls. So if we had water intrusion, there wasn't a bunch of building materials pressed upon one another. Certainly wasn't a bunch of paper-based building materials pressed upon one another that trap moisture. We actually had so much space between our walls that there was enough air movement that would help dry the structure, right? So you didn't really see mold problems based upon the design and based upon the types of materials we used in homes back in the day. That all started to change due to this push for energy efficiency. On top of that, another unintended consequence of energy efficiency is homes are tighter and tighter. I mean, in some jurisdictions, they're actually literally doing tests, like smoke tests, to test how much air left the facility, the home or the facility or building. And the unintended consequence of that is if I've got water intrusion, right, and I have bacteria and mold growing inside a building because of that water intrusion, I'm going to be breathing in a higher concentration every breath that I take, because there's no exchange of air that we have in these older buildings, right? We're lessening the exchange of air. And I'd say probably another thing is, we have a much more generalized awareness of the air we breathe today than they really have ever had. If you ever want to get a kick out of mold, there is a mold remediation protocol in the Bible, in the Old Testament under Leviticus. He talks about how when there was mold present inside of these homes, obviously built out of stone back in those days, they would literally go in, clean them. They would come in and bless the home. And then if it came back, they would actually take the home down and take those tainted stones and carry them outside the village. We've had some understanding that, mold and fungus might not be the best thing, for us and living in and breathing in high amounts for some time, but certainly it's a bigger issue today.
was in the Old Testament.
Leviticus. Yep.
That blows my mind. Let's start with what do we need to be? What's the early warning?
What's the early warning? So I think the easiest thing for us to look for is not necessarily mold. That's actually for water damage, right? Because water damage is the early warning. I'm not going to have mold if I don't have moisture or water intrusion problems in my home, my building, my office, etc. So when I start seeing leaks, and those leaks are continuously happen without being taken care of and remediated properly, I know not too far behind it, 24 to 48 hours, we're going to start to see some species of mold growing. I understand that humidity is a big warning sign. If I have consistently high humidity, what's high humidity? 60% relative humidity or more with, days or weeks upon end. Again, and within that 24 to 48 hour period, I could have certain species of mold beginning to develop. And so the early warning signs that I'm going to be paying attention to are, the visible signs of water damage. It could be paint crackling, buckling of floors, buckling of baseboards. And I'm also going to be noticing my sense of smell, mold growth. When mold is actually feeding off of building materials, it produces what's called microbial VOCs. MVOCs they typically give off that earthy cigar, wet basement like smell that we have become accustomed to in our lives. And that's actually,
I've seen the word, I've seen VOC used on your websites. What does VOC stand for?
Volatile organic compound. Essentially, it's an off gassing that occurs. So VO, like probably the most common VOC that we all know is paint. When paint's curing, it's off gassing, it's producing an odor. That odor is picked up by the olfactory senses. So VOCs are how our bodies attribute to smells, right? And so different VOCs produce different smells, and that's how we actually register those smells through our olfactory senses.
All right, so I've got the early warning signals of mold in my house. So if I notice that, good for me. But suppose it's happening somewhere where I can't see it, and you have a nose like I have, which is I can't smell, save my life. And the reason we're having you on this show, this is not a builder's show. This is not a remodeler's show. This is about physical health. I'm assuming that there's going to be some signals in terms of health.
Yeah.
What are those?
I'd say the top two things that people correlate with mold exposure right away would be brain fog and chronic fatigue. Those are the two things you hear about quite frequently. There's another chronic inflammatory response syndrome is another syndrome that came off of mold exposure and the exposure to water damaged buildings. And obviously chronic inflammation is something that you could experience with mold exposure, which obviously can lead to obesity, heart failure, things of that nature. And so I think those three things, from the inflammation, the brain fog, and the chronic fatigue, that's stuff you hear about, I would say probably most frequently. Then you also see like skin issues, rashes, hives, which usually coincides with more gut health issues, but you would see sort of those effects as well as your typical, alarm bell is going off.
Yeah,
I want to hear from you then. So we're guiding people, we're encouraging people to get their health straightened out by primarily eat whole real foods, get sufficient exercise and sunshine and sleep, and reduce the stress in your life. And every now and then we'll hear from people who are, I'm doing everything right, at least according to their testimony, and I'm still having trouble. Is that something we look at? Do we look at indoor air quality?
I think that's one of the greatest opportunities, is because when we think about health, I'm not a doctor, and actually, we have one here right on the call with us. So really exciting opportunity here. But when I take myself out of the equation and I look at, okay, I want to be healthy. And that's a difficult thing to do today because there's so much misinformation out there. But if I want to be healthy, probably the first things that I think of is I want to eat clean food, whatever that means. I want to drink clean water, whatever that means. Because when I say whatever that means, I mean, there's arguments on what clean food actually is, which type of filtration system provides the cleanest water, and you have arguments there. And I want clean air, right? Now, when I say clean air, that's almost never on anybody's radar. And everybody goes straight to, I'm going to the doctor, I'm not sleeping, I don't feel my best. And they go right to, maybe I'm not dieting, maybe I'm not exercising properly, maybe I'm not drinking enough water. Almost nobody thinks about the air they're breathing. And I'm here to tell you today, that might be your hangup. That might be the exact reason why you aren't reaching your health goals, because it's not even on your radar when it should be at the top of your list. And there's a couple different reasons why it should be at the top of your list. You take 20,000 breaths every single day. You consume 2,500 gallons of air, which is enough to fill up a normal sized swimming pool. And you unintendedly inhale hundreds of millions of particles every single day. But yet you're not aware of it because you see through the air. And I think it's because it's not on people's radar, because it's not on people's list. People live in toxic houses all the time, and they never equate that it could be their environment and the environmental exposures that's causing the hang up, right? And when you look at the research, it's going to be really difficult because you start to see, okay, inhalational Alzheimer's can be caused by mycotoxins, not by mold directly, but a byproduct that mold can create. You're going to see things like, how mycotoxins can alter hormonal and metabolic regulation, right? Well, what's the unintended consequences of that? We already mentioned inflammation, right? So I think it's such a wide-reaching topic that it becomes really hard to nail down. And you've got different camps of researchers that are researching very targeted things. Unless you're connecting all the dots together, thousands of papers of research to get to this point, it becomes really difficult to know, okay, what are the just few warning signs? Because there could be so many.
Yeah, what I've started to notice in my practice, exactly the scenarios that Jack talked about, where, patients seem to be doing the things we usually recommend, and they've gotten some improvement, but they're not quite there. They're still showing signs of, for instance, inflammation, and that has got me thinking about, and we start testing for, problems related to mold in particular. And it's not unusual, actually, in those patients that we find issues. And it's gotten me thinking about, and this was certainly one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, whether we should be doing that earlier in the process, right? It's kind of obvious, like you said, what you're eating, right? And people think about that every day. It's not as obvious, what's in the air that we're breathing, and could there be problems with that? But, we opened up the podcast by saying, there's probably a large percentage of homes and buildings in this country that have problematic air. So it would be very logical to think, and I think, like you said, we're starting to see a fair amount of science supporting this, that air is contributing negatively to people's health. What I guess, the question then becomes, right, I don't even want to say what the priorities is, right, because I think all of these factors need to be looked at together. But, how should people start thinking about the air? What are some of the things that you recommend them doing if they acknowledge they're unhealthy and they're thinking that maybe it's somehow related to the air they're breathing?
I think really the best way for people to really understand their environment scientifically would be by testing your dust. Using MSQ PCR technology, looking at the specificity of...
Whoa. Slow down. MSPCR.
MSQ PCR.
MSQ PCR.
Yeah.
I do not know how to pronounce that.
Okay. So it's MSQ, which stands for mold specific quantitative PCR, the same PCR that we all have become very accustomed to with COVID. It's mold specific PCR. And it, just like PCR technology, it's looking at the DNA of what's there. And so with that test, and I love this test specifically for two reasons. One, it's a better screening tool than testing your air. To get the same result, you would need to take air samples strategically all throughout the house, all different variations, because the air testing tells you the further away you test from the source, the less likely you are to pick it up as abnormal, right? Because basically all the test does is take isolated spores that are coming off of a source, trap them in a slide, and then again, using microscopy, someone's counting those individual spores, right? When you use the dust test and the technology specifically to test the dust as a screening tool, you're getting a good sense of what is you're actually picking up across many different species that can be broken down. And then you can correlate those species of molds with the specific toxins that they produce. And then using like organic acid tests, mycotoxin testing, you could actually show a correlation between the mold in people's homes and the toxins that it's creating in their bodies, which is really interesting from a health perspective for somebody wanting to know, well, how much is my home contributing to me versus maybe it was the home that I lived in 2-3 years ago that was pretty moldy. I think it helps people understand their current environment versus maybe some previous ones, but also looking at it from this perspective of, for a couple $100, I can get some answers and understand from the onset, especially working with medical practitioners, what's the likelihood mold is playing an impact or the air quality in my house is playing an impact on my health. And I think answering that earlier on without getting, investigators to come in and inspect your home could really give you a clue as to, is this a problem or is this not? And you could save money if it's not the problem. Now you've spent a couple $100 instead of a couple $1,000 and, you've answered that question. Yes, it is. Yes, it isn't.
And yeah, in your experience, whether or not it's a problem for someone, what are some of the factors that go into that? Is it a matter of how much mold is in the house or in the air? Is it a factor of certain people being more susceptible to the negative effects of mold? Are there other things kind of to be thinking about there?
I think the answer is all the above. And I think I've personally worked with enough people now to really get a good gamut and good understanding of, what we're actually dealing with. I think that I have seen cases of people that were so sensitive to their environment that something even nominally elevated, let's say it was 10 times higher than what it should be, for something that's so small. I know 10 times sounds like a crazy number, but remember, we're dealing with something that's 25 to 50 times smaller than what the eye can see. 10 times in comparison is really not that much. We could be talking about, 1/16 of the size of the head of a pin. Okay. Just to give size and perspective in this, if I see something that's 10 times higher than it should be, and it's one species that's elevated out of 36 different species, but that person is still reacting to that environment, I'll tell you that person is definitely sensitive, and that person might need a more hospital grade environment than the average person might need. So I think that plays a big role into it for sure. The good news is that for the average person, really they don't have far to go from where their home is to where their home needs to be, which is all in normal ranges. So what I like about this test is this test basically was EPA and HUD did a joint study, the American Healthy Home Survey 1 in 2006, and they updated again, did a second survey in 2019. And so we've got a pretty decent data set to operate off of. And what they were able to do is by surveying all these different homes, they're able to really put together a range of what's considered normal, what a normal home would have, right? Versus a water damaged home, which you obviously would expect would have higher levels of mold growth. So by establishing a range of normal, we can actually view homes and say, okay, this home has 1,000 times higher, more Stachybotrys than it should, or 100 times more, higher Aspergillus fumigatus than it should. And through that process, we can understand some risk factors. The way I operate in this field, it's very much like how you probably operate. Looking at a person, you're looking at each unique factors that you possibly can. And you're trying to separate and discern what could be the problems here that are driving this outcome. I'm looking at a home this in a similar fashion where I'm saying, looking at these different species that are elevated, I'm asking questions such as, when's the last time you've cleaned your HVAC, right? I'm asking questions about their cleaning routines. How often do you clean your home? Because we could have an unintended consequence of buildup if they're not cleaning their home frequently enough, because guess what? Mold is going to come in from outside, right? I'm looking at when's the last, did they have leaks in the past? What did they do when they had those leaks? Did they act quickly? Did they repair it quickly? Or did they just leave it and let it grow mold? And I think through this process of understanding their unique circumstance, I can help guide them on improving the environment in a way that's actually tailored to them. And if they are working with a doctor and they have specific correlations between certain species of molds and the toxins that they can produce, and we could see certain biomarkers that are affecting them, then I'm going to say, if aspergillus is a problem for you based upon your internal lab tests, we probably should focus on reducing the levels of aspergillus that you're being exposed to. And so the way in which we curate this process for them is really tailored to them. And, I'm looking at it from this, personalized medicine approach specifically for their home. And the outcomes we see, I mean, to be honest, some of them are miraculous. We've had people that, went from literally, I'm so sick, I have a GJ feeding tube installed in my lower intestine to feed me the nutrients to keep me alive, to walking again with no GJ feeding tube, to acute stuff. Just like a friend of mine the other day is, hey, since I installed that air purifier you recommended, I'm like sleeping the best sleep of my life. And that's more acute transformations. But I think where we're at today, we don't understand the full breadth of this. But I'll tell you, like, just all of the different people that I've helped just make even from the most miraculous to the most acute transformations through the power of air quality, it's been eye-opening for sure.
So one of the questions that occurs to me is, if I'm just asking for a sanity check here. I live in a 70-year-old home. That's one of those homes you talked about that has that, I can't remember what you called it.
Balloon frame?
Balloon frame, yeah. It's a layer of brick, a layer of air, and another layer of brick. It will survive the apocalypse. I mean, it's just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not airtight by any stretch of the imagination. And I live in the desert, so it's probably far less of an issue anyway. But if I'm in a newer home, I know that one of the things that when I was working on building a new home and studying all the different ways to go about it, there was this focus on it being really tight for the purposes of energy efficiency. I had a friend who built a house with the stress panels. It's a layer of OSB and then a thick layer of styrofoam and then another layer of OSB. And it was like a 3,000 square foot house. And, he was able to cool it in the summertime with an ice cube blowing across, a fan blowing across an ice cube. I mean, something
Sure.
ridiculous, It was super, super airtight. Like when you'd close the door, your ears would pop. And I just thought, oh, wow, that's so cool. But what I'm hearing now is there's all kinds of downsides to a tight house. And that raises the question, so what do we do? I've focused on making sure that my air conditioner is the right size, and I'm saving all kinds of energy in the summer when I turn it on and energy in the heat when I'm using it. And I'm not getting the air exchange that I need. Am I reading this right? Am I hearing this right?
You are. Yeah, you are hearing this right. And it's probably one of the biggest mistakes that we've made over the past, decade or so, is we're thinking too much about how much energy we're saving. And I get it. Like, I understand why, but we're not thinking about the occupants inside. And we need to do both. It can't be an and or thing. And it has to be both. And I want you to think about a couple different things. You live in a house that has no air exchange. And I'll tell you what we can do. There's ways you can retrofit and bring air exchange in. Good news, right? ERV systems, fresh air intakes. There's solutions. But unless you know to install one of those solutions, unless it's part of your new build, which for so many homes has not been part of the new build plan, we have some issues. And so think about when you're in a tight house, right? You are excreting bacteria. You're excreting viruses into the environment. Every time you clean something, you're spraying some chemical into the environment, right? Every time you bring in furniture, that furniture's off-gassing. You paint walls, the walls off-gassing, right? Your flooring's off-gassing. I mean, the buildings do breathe themselves, right? And as human beings, you're constantly breathing that stuff in, and your body has to constantly filter those things out. Yes, some of them are gases, some of them might be liquids. A large portion of them are going to be particles. Now, the American Lung Association says anything smaller than 10 microns poses the greatest human health risk because it's so small it bypasses our self-defense mechanisms and it enters our bloodstream. Well, once it enters our bloodstream, now we're ingesting it, right? So it goes from inhalation then to ingestion. Not to mention, they say the skin's the largest organ or something like that. We've all heard that. We also have the dermal exposure we want to be considerate of. And these tiny particles, depending on their size, can bypass our skin and absorb into us that way as well, right? And so that they call that dermal exposure. So you think about all these little things that we do, plus unintended consequences of water coming into our house, creating mold and bacteria. You combine all of that, and it's no wonder we're getting sick more frequently. Our immune systems are shot because they're overloaded just trying to keep up with these toxic boxes that we've put ourselves in. I think that's something that we are starting to realize. We are starting to, incorporate fresh air and this passive ventilation and things of that nature. But I mean, I don't know the exact number, but we've built a lot of homes that are really tight without that in mind and are still continuing to, because it depends on the architect and the builder you have.
I want to think from the standpoint of somebody who's listening to this show and would be having what I think would be a reasonable amount of skepticism. This just sounds like a guy who's in the business, who's cranking up the negative intensity because fear sells. And I don't think that's an unreasonable response. I don't think that's an unreasonable reaction. Although I will say nothing you've said sounds like it's outside the realm of reason of a reasonable problem. So what does the average person need to do as kind of an initial, let's take this off the table as a problem? Where do I start? Just to make sure, maybe it's all bullshit, but maybe it's real. And what's something simple that we can do to find out?
Sure. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go over to the EPA's website and they'll tell you your indoor air environment can be minimally 5 times worse than the outdoor air that you're breathing. And so I think that's an important thing to hold on to, because we're talking about indoor versus outdoor, right? We all feel great outside. Who doesn't go outside and not feel great? But in our own homes, especially if you've ever gone away for a weekend, you've come back to your house and you've started to notice, I felt a lot better when I was on vacation or whatnot. It's a pretty good telltale sign. But I'm here to tell you that, this isn't here to sell you something. I do want you to open your windows more often and bring fresh air in. I think we can all accomplish that. I do want you to clean more frequently than you might have, because if you're not cleaning once a week and you're not consistently removing dust, remember I said, to check your air quality, the best way to do it is to test your dust. Obviously, the more dust you allow to accumulate, right, the more opportunity you have for these contaminants to enter your body 20,000 times per day. I am here to tell you that, air purification devices, they come in many shapes, colors, and sizes, many different price points. I think you should invest in one. And I think just like you filter your water, you should filter your air. And the key there is you want to buy one that can filter out the smallest particle possible at the highest efficiency possible. That's the name of the game. So if you don't care about bells and whistles, Wi-Fi this, and having a great, app and all that fun stuff, you don't need to spend thousands of dollars. Okay. You can get a really good air purifier for $100 or less that can remove a tiny particle from your air. I'd say start there, right? if you've got sources of mold growing in your home and they're creating so many particles or so many toxins, you might have to remediate, right? And there's no way around that. But I think for a large majority of people, you want to come at, I appreciate the skepticism that you might have in listening to this conversation. I want you to go away for a weekend and notice if you feel better when you're outside your house versus inside your house. That's a good thing to do. I want you to open your windows more, and I want you to
I love
feel.
this. We're telling people, hey, for your health, you need to take a vacation. Yes, guys, you heard it on Dr. Ovadia's show. Take your wife away for the weekend, get out of town. And hey, it's for our health, honey. It's for our health. Okay.
Great. I want you to open your windows more, right? A little complex there because if the air quality index is not great outside, you might not want that inside. But on a nice, cool day where it's not raining, there's not too much humidity, please open those windows, get some fresh air in. Notice how you feel when you have the windows open versus the house all shut up, right? You might feel something. Notice how you feel when you get an air purifier and plug it into your bedroom and see how you sleep better. I mean, all these things are simple, actionable things we can all do right now. Yeah. You don't want to invest in like a good dust test. Got another free tip to check for mold. Go over to your toilet tank right now. Hit pause on this thing. Go over to your toilet tank right now. Take the cover off, flip the lid over, look on the underside of the lid, look inside the toilet tank. You see a bunch of mold growing in there. It might be nearby opportunistically creating enough particles to get into that toilet tank, right? And so another free little tip and trick you can do. I think, for me, I appreciate the skepticism. At the same time, I'm trying to ignite a fire in you right now, listening to, if I've tried everything and nothing else is working, I probably haven't tried the most simple thing, which is the air you breathe, which is the one thing you take for granted each and every day as you wake up and move throughout life. And that might be the damn thing that's holding you back. And that's the simple takeaway message I want people to have when they listen to this.
Now, I was going to kind of ask follow up there, if you have identified it. So I live in Florida, right? There's a lot of, mold issues. Many houses have this. And I oftentimes hear stories of, they get the mold remediation companies to come out and, they do all this stuff that's fairly expensive most of the time, and they do all sorts of cleanings and this and that, and it gets better for a little while, and then and then the mold is back. And maybe talk a little bit about what people should be thinking about if they have truly identified they have a problem and now they need to deal with it. What are some of those things that they should be doing? Maybe what shouldn't they be doing in terms of fixing the problem itself?
Yeah. So I think, it comes back to root cause issues, right? If you just superficially remove mold, I don't care how much you spend, it's coming back because you didn't actually solve the root cause problem of why mold grew in the first place. Mold is a symptom of a sick home. And the home is sick because water is getting in or too much moisture is getting in, right? If I just go in and rip out walls and put everything back, guess what? It's going to come right back. And so there could be many different reasons why your house has mold. Maybe your windows are leaking. Maybe your roof is leaking. Maybe you've got water coming in from outside to inside. Maybe your humidity is too high. By the way, I live in Tampa, Florida. So I'm with you on the Florida. I understand how difficult it is to keep mold at bay in Florida, but it is possible. And I'm living proof of this. And it's by understanding that Florida is a humid environment.
House down every other couple of weeks? Is that
every few weeks I burn it down, rebuild, build back better. When you look at Florida, one of the things you have to be considerate of is the climate that you're in. And I think you need to be considerate of the climate you're in no matter where you build. I would build a house very differently in Florida than I would in Arizona, right? The thing in Florida is you need to control moisture coming in. Very difficult to do because they're all stucco houses. Stucco naturally absorbs moisture. The second thing that you need to do is you need to control the amount of humidity that increases inside the house. Very hard to do. Florida's full of humidity. It's possible, right? Because if you use the right products on the stucco and behind the stucco to actually slow down the moisture migration. I'll give you I think what I put on my house is like Sherman-Williams Rain Refresh. It's a hydrophobic coating. It literally repels water. You want something like that on your house when you live in Florida and it rains like cats and dogs and you have moisture migration like you wouldn't believe. you want a hydrophobic coating on the exterior of your house. So I went and I painted my house with a hydrophobic coating. Okay. On the inside, I have 2 really good AC units. They're appropriately sized. Appropriately sized AC units are important no matter where you live, but especially in Florida, because if they're not cycling the way they're supposed to, they're not going to be removing the humidity from the air. And AC units do naturally do that when the AC is running. So I've got 2 beautifully sized AC units. When I bought this house, I had to redo some of the ductwork to make sure that it fit the appropriate size, got the appropriate CFMs, all technical terms you don't necessarily need to know. You just need to know that they're appropriately sized and working as they're intended. And I have supplemental dehumidifiers so that if the humidity crosses 50%, these things kick on. With that being said, those 2 things, I'm able to control the amount of humidity that happens inside my home in Florida, where humidity is a problem, and prevent that growth. Now, if I have a leaking roof and I don't stop the roof leak, I'm just going to continue to get mold. If I have a humidity problem and I don't control the humidity, I'm going to continue to get mold. As you can see, there might be pipe leaks, there might be grading issues. There can be all different kinds of problems that are unique to your home. But if you invest money into something and they don't actually solve the root cause problem of why it's growing in the first place, then it's going to be more like a waste of money than an investment.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
a lot how we talk about health, right? That same thing, right? You can, in my specialty, people get heart disease and we put a stent in, or we do bypass surgery, or we, maybe even prescribe medication. But if we don't get to the root cause of why they're getting the heart disease, we're never really going to solve the heart disease. Very much in line there. And then, and I know, again, you're not a medical practitioner and you're not going to be giving medical advice here, but maybe talk about some of the things you've seen in terms of, is it only for people that have been affected by this now, right? And they had mold in their environment, they're having health problems related to it. Is just removing, stopping the exposure to it enough, or are there other things that people sometimes need to do to then help them heal from the mold or air related illnesses?
Yeah, so out of all of the cases I've ever worked with, anybody that's ever gotten better, it's because they fixed their house and had a doctor, right? It's not, I work miracles in your home. I'm not a miracle worker. And so with that being said, I think we talked about this earlier, but there are a confluence of factors that are typically leading up to this. And, there is not only damage that mold can cause and the exposure that mold can cause, and you can measure that through different biomarkers, right? But once I remove the mold, that's great that you're now no longer, increasing your exposure to these things, but you still have work to do. I mean, you've got biomarkers that are going to be elevated that need to get back in line. And this all depends on what you and your healthcare provider have found to be a problem that needs to be worked on through your specific diagnoses and, the different situations you might have been exposed to that led you down this path. And so I think it's really important. I always look at this as a teamwork approach. You want to cut off your exposure, but you really do need a doctor. And honestly, getting rid of the mold, yes, you'll probably find some noticeable things right away for sure. But you're going to have issues that you're going to have to overcome, that you're going to need the help of a medical provider. So I do want to make that abundantly clear. That's part of the process.
Bill, Michael, this question is good for you as well. Are people who are metabolically healthy more able to process and deal with and fight off this kinds of toxins in the environment? Or is it something that's going to affect everybody equally? Even as I asked the question, I think the answer is, yeah, if you're metabolically healthy, you're in better shape anyway. But what do you say?
Some of the studies show that mold exposure can lead to metabolic dysregulation. And so I think it's if you're metabolically healthy, obviously you're not having an issue with that, but can it lead to you becoming metabolically unhealthy and with long-term exposure? I think that's where we need a lot more research and more fine tuning. Like, I think we look at it from this perspective of, and I think this is just part of the evolution of trying to get our arms wrapped around this. It's sure, if you're unhealthy and you're exposed to mold, you're probably likely going to have way worse reactions than someone who's healthy. But I think we also need to understand, what are the long-term health effects of someone who's healthy, and how does that help drive them towards being unhealthy, where then it just exacerbates like you wouldn't believe, right? And I think
That makes sense.
To be fair, the only real funding we've had with mold exposure is through some of the studies with mycophenolic acid. Are you guys familiar with mycophenolic acid?
I'm not.
Okay. So they use, it's a toxin derived from mold. Aspergillus and penicillium produce it, and they use it as a immune suppressant drug. And the goal is to suppress your immune system on purpose. Typically, this happens like an organ transplant, right? So you're suppressing your immune system on purpose so you're not rejecting that organ. The thing is, like, that makes sense under a medically advised and controlled subject, right? What happens if you're inhaling mycophenolic acid all day because you've got a problem with aspergillus or penicillium overgrowth in your environment? Now you're suppressing your immune system, but not on purpose. And what are the unintended consequences of that? And I think, we have a good set of information around that because it's been studied, because two pharmaceutical companies have invested heavily in studying that. And so some of the sad things we know about mycophenolic acid exposure is it increases the likelihood that you will have a miscarriage by 50%, meaning 50% chance if you are on enough mycophenolic acid, specifically on these two drugs, you have 50% chance of a miscarriage. So obviously, when you're on this drug, your goal is not to get pregnant. Your goal is to, not reject this organ transplant. 25% of the people that didn't miscarriage, they're showing malformations. In this specific study, we've seen some studies around mold exposure and miscarriages and infertility and some of these issues. It's just interesting to see, because if you don't know where to look for these studies, they're kind of disjointed. You have to literally go into the research on the pharmaceutical mycophenolic acid to find this stuff. But I think it begs a good question. Okay, how can I measure as much mycophenolic acid as I would take in this pill? How can I measure that in my environment? And am I going to have the same result ingesting it versus inhalation, which then would lead to ingesting it? And so these are questions that I can't fully answer to you right now, but I think the interesting thing of all of this is we've got a lot to learn, and we've got some information out there that we've already learned from that we haven't really put together cohesively.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of summary of where we're at, that we've got a lot to learn about this. I think it's yet another factor that we're realizing, all of this disease that we're seeing around us, all of this poor health that we're seeing around us, right? It didn't just happen. It's coming from, specific things that we're doing, that we're being exposed to. And, I hope people just start questioning more, right? Don't just accept that you're sick for reasons that we don't know, and and we're going to try and treat it with some medication, right? That's not an answer to your health. And what we've been trying to accomplish is getting people to think more about their health, think about the root causes. And this is certainly something that I've learned along the journey, right? We talked a lot about, like Jack said, food and sleep and stress and sun. And I am increasingly recognizing, and I encourage everyone else to increasingly think about the air that we're breathing as another source of toxins to think about. If people want to learn more, Michael, how can they connect with you? Where should they go to?
There's one thing I want to leave you with. I love the fact that, we should be asking these questions. How I got into this career was by asking the questions I was asking was like, how can people be in moldy houses if the houses were remediated after the hurricane? And so by asking all these questions, it led me down this path. So I invite everybody to continue to question things and try to get to that root cause, like you said. With that being said, the global health is in a health decline. right? It's 60% of the global population deals with at least one chronic condition. I saw a study the other day, is like 79% of the US adult population's on at least one prescription drug. We've never been sicker than we are today. It's a sad reality, but it's true, right? How is that possible? The advancements in medicine and technology with everyone's got a Peloton and has access to working out and organic food and clean this, and you wouldn't believe, right? But yet we're still getting sicker. And certainly something has to change, right? And I feel like it's people like you that are helping to lead that change. You're showing us that change is possible. And you're doing that by bringing on experts that are helping people to really challenge the paradigm. And the thing that I want to leave you with is, I love, if you're skeptical at all, good, you should be. And you should be, because you should question everything. But take this into consideration. If we're getting worse and worse, don't you think we should start looking at some of the more obvious places? And I think one of the most obvious places to look is the air you're breathing. That's my final pitch to you. And it's because I want to see you well. And unfortunately, it's far and far from the case. And we have a great opportunity to do something that for people to leave a legacy behind, to leave a better world in place than what we have today. And so that's why I'm here. And thank you so much for having me on.
So website, contact information, social media. We've got most of that information that will show up in the show notes, but why don't you give that to us now?
Yeah, I get it. If you feel like you need to connect with me personally, please go to themichaelrubino.com. You could find me on there. If you're in need of, remediation, homecleanse.com has a bunch of services and products for you. And if you've been moved by anything that I've had to share with you today, I have a 501c3 nonprofit called changetheairfoundation.org, focused on policy reform, education, and research. So these are the 3 places you might be able to find me. And thank you so much for listening to me talk.
All right. Our guest has been Michael Rubino, themichaelrubino.com. And what was the other one?
Homecleanse.com.
Homecleanse.com. That contact information will be in our show notes. We thank you for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Avedia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.